The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting golden streaks across the marble floors. Catherine stood before the ornate mirror in her private dressing room, her heart beating steadily as a team of stylists moved around her with quiet efficiency. Today was not just another royal engagement. Today, her husband would be crowned king, and she would take her place as queen consort before the watching world. She had barely slept the night before. Not from nervousness about the ceremony itself, but from the weight of everything this moment represented. 3 children slept peacefully down the hall, unaware that when they woke their lives would shift into an entirely new chapter. George, at 10 years old, would no longer be simply a prince but the heir to the throne. Charlotte and Louis would carry new responsibilities too, ones they were still too young to fully understand. The dress hanging beside her was a masterpiece of ivory silk and delicate embroidery. Designers had worked for months on every detail, ensuring it would honor tradition while speaking to a modern era. Catherine reached out to touch the fabric, feeling its cool smoothness beneath her fingers. She thought about all the women who had worn similar gowns before her, walking down that same Abbey aisle, carrying the same mixture of duty and hope. Her lead stylist, Amanda, approached with the first layer of the ensemble. The woman had been with her for years, through pregnancies and public appearances, through moments of joy and periods of intense scrutiny. Their eyes met in the mirror, and Amanda offered a small, encouraging smile. No words were needed between them. This relationship had been built on trust and understanding. As the dress was carefully lowered over her head, Catherine closed her eyes briefly. She remembered the young woman she had been when she first met William at university. Back then, she could never have imagined this day. She had been ordinary, middle class, with dreams that looked nothing like the reality she now inhabited. Her mother had raised her to be confident and capable, but nothing could have prepared her for the scrutiny that came with loving a prince. The fabric settled around her shoulders, and hands began fastening dozens of tiny buttons down her back. Catherine opened her eyes and studied her reflection. The woman looking back at her was composed, elegant, carrying herself with the grace expected of someone in her position. But beneath that polished exterior, she was still Kate Middleton from Berkshire, still the girl who loved photography and enjoyed quiet weekends with her family. Her jewelry was brought forward on velvet cushions, each piece selected with care. The earrings had belonged to William's grandmother, a gesture that made her throat tighten with emotion. Queen Elizabeth had worn them on her own coronation day decades earlier. Catherine took one in her hand, feeling its weight, thinking about the woman who had carried the crown with such dignity for so long. When her phone buzzed on the nearby table, she glanced at it to see a message from Pippa, her sister. Just 3 words. "You've got this." Catherine smiled, feeling some of the tension in her shoulders ease. Her family had been her anchor through everything. When the press had been cruel, when the adjustment to royal life had felt overwhelming, they had reminded her of who she really was. The hairstylist began working on her updo, pinning each section with precision. Catherine had requested something elegant but not too elaborate. She wanted to look like herself, not like she was wearing a costume. The compromise had taken several fittings to achieve, but looking at the result now, she felt satisfied. Her hair was swept back in a way that would showcase the jewelry while still feeling natural. Amanda brought forward the shoes, handcrafted in Italy with embroidery that matched the dress. Catherine slipped them on, standing to test their comfort. She would be on her feet for hours today, walking, standing, kneeling. Every detail had to be perfect, not for vanity but for practicality. A soft knock at the door interrupted the preparation. William entered, already dressed in his ceremonial uniform. The sight of him took her breath away for a moment, just as it had all those years ago when they first met. His face showed the strain of the morning, the gravity of what lay ahead, but when his eyes found hers, they softened. He crossed the room and took both her hands in his. No one else in the room existed for that brief moment. They had weathered so much together, built a partnership that had survived intense public interest and personal challenges. Today would test them in new ways, but they would face it together. William squeezed her hands gently before stepping back. He was needed elsewhere, for final briefings and preparations, but that moment of connection had steadied them both. Catherine watched him leave, then turned back to the mirror for the final touches. The tiara was brought forward last, glittering with diamonds that caught the morning light. As it was carefully positioned on her head, Catherine felt the physical weight of it and everything it represented. This was no longer preparation for a role she might one day fill. This was real, happening now, and in a few hours. The world would watch her step into a position that would define the rest of her life. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and met her own gaze in the mirror. The woman looking back was ready, even if the girl inside still felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of it all. It was time to go to Westminster Abbey. The motorcade moved through London streets lined with thousands of people. Catherine sat in the state car, her posture perfect, her expression serene even as her mind raced with thoughts. Through the tinted windows she could see the crowds, some holding signs, others waving flags, all gathered to witness this historic moment. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, their faces painted with Union Jacks. Elderly people stood with walking sticks, determined to be present for this coronation after witnessing the last one decades ago. The diversity of the crowd struck her. People from every background imaginable, all united in this shared experience. She thought about what this day meant to each of them. For some, it was tradition and pageantry, a connection to centuries of history. For others, it represented stability in uncertain times, a continuation of an institution that had endured wars, social change, and personal scandals. And for a few, she knew it was simply a chance to be part of something bigger than themselves, to tell their grandchildren they had been there. The car slowed as they approached Westminster Abbey. Catherine could see the ancient structure rising before them, its Gothic architecture as breathtaking as ever. How many coronations had these walls witnessed? How many queens had walked through those doors carrying their own fears and hopes? Security personnel lined the route, their presence a reminder of modern realities that couldn't be ignored. The world was different now than it had been at the last coronation. Threats were more sophisticated, public sentiment more divided. Not everyone cheering in these crowds supported the monarchy. Some were here to protest, to voice opposition to an institution they saw as outdated. Catherine had read the criticism, seen the polls showing declining support among younger generations. She understood their concerns about relevance and cost. It was part of why she had worked so hard on her early years initiative, trying to show that the royal family could be a force for meaningful change. But today wasn't about defending the institution. Today was about honoring a commitment William had been born into. The car came to a stop. Through the window, she could see officials waiting, their faces solemn with the importance of their roles. This was it, the moment when everything shifted from preparation to reality. Catherine took one final deep breath, checked her reflection in the small compact mirror, and waited for her door to be opened. The sounds of the crowd washed over her as she stepped out, the cheers and calls blending into a wall of noise. Camera flashes went off in rapid succession despite the bright morning sun. She kept her expression warm but composed, offering a small wave to the crowd as she had been trained to do. Her lady-in-waiting appeared at her side, ready to assist with the long train of her dress. Catherine was grateful for the familiar face, someone who understood the unspoken communication needed at moments like these. Together, they moved toward the Abbey entrance, each step measured and graceful. The noise from outside began to fade as she entered the building. The change was dramatic, from chaos to hushed reverence. Inside, the Abbey was filled with dignitaries, foreign royals, politicians, and select members of the public who had won the lottery to attend. Every seat was filled, every eye turning to watch her entrance. She recognized faces in the crowd, foreign queens who had become friends over the years, offering advice and understanding that few others could provide, Commonwealth leaders with whom she and William had built relationships during their tours. And there, in a reserved section, her own family, her parents looking proud and slightly overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding them. Her mother caught her eye and mouthed something Catherine couldn't quite make out, but the message was clear in her expression. Love, support, encouragement. Carol Middleton had always been her daughter's biggest champion, even when the press had been unkind. Even when the adjustment to royal life had strained their family dynamic. The music began, a haunting melody performed by the Abbey choir. Catherine recognized it from rehearsals, but hearing it now, in this moment, with the weight of history pressing down, it sounded different. More profound. The voices echoed off the stone walls, filling every corner of the vast space. She processed down the aisle, her pace steady and unhurried. This walk felt eternal. each step taking her further from her old life and deeper into her new role. She passed faces she knew, others she didn't, all watching with varying expressions. Some showed genuine happiness, others mere curiosity, and a few seemed to be studying her critically, perhaps wondering if she was worthy of this moment. William stood at the front, waiting. Even from a distance she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself with rigid formality. This was harder for him than most people understood. He had never wanted this responsibility, had watched his father wait decades for this moment, had seen the toll the role took on those who held it. When she reached her designated position, she could finally see his face clearly. He looked at her with such intensity, such gratitude, that she felt tears threaten to form. But she couldn't cry, not here, not now. Instead, she offered him the smallest of smiles, a private moment of connection in this very public ceremony. The Archbishop stepped forward, his robes magnificent, his voice carrying centuries of authority. He began the opening prayers, words that had been spoken at every coronation, linking this moment to all those that had come before. Catherine bowed her head, trying to find meaning in the ritual, trying to feel the spiritual significance others claimed for this ceremony. Around her, the abbey seemed to hold its breath. 2,000 people sat in complete silence, waiting for the transformation that was about to occur. A man and woman would enter as prince and princess. They would leave as king and queen. The titles would be the same, but everything else would change. Catherine's mind drifted briefly to her children watching from their seats. George was old enough to understand the significance, to know that his own future was being shaped by what happened today. She hoped he wasn't frightened by the weight of it all. She hoped Charlotte and Louis were simply enjoying the spectacle, too young to grasp the full implications. The ceremony continued, each element carefully choreographed and rich with symbolism. Catherine participated where required, spoke her parts clearly, moved when directed. But part of her remained detached, observing it all from a distance, still unable to quite believe this was really happening to the girl from Berkshire who had once dreamed of far simpler things. The moment arrived when William would be crowned. Catherine watched as he approached the ancient St. Edward's chair, the seat where monarchs had been crowned for over 700 years. The chair looked worn, its gilded wood showing age, but that only added to its power. This wasn't some prop created for today. This was history made physical. The crown was lifted from its cushion, and even from where she stood, Catherine could see how heavy it was. Solid gold encrusted with jewels, it represented not just power but the immense weight of responsibility. The Archbishop raised it slowly, ceremonially, and the entire abbey seemed to lean forward in anticipation. When the crown was placed on William's head, something shifted in the atmosphere. The man she had married was still there, but he was also transformed into something else, something larger than himself. He became the embodiment of an institution, a symbol of continuity and national identity. Catherine felt the change ripple through the room, felt the collective recognition that a new era had truly begun. Trumpets sounded, their bright notes filling the abbey. People began to cheer, though the sound was restrained, appropriate for the solemnity of the location. Catherine added her own voice to the celebration, calling out words of support and love for her husband, now her king. Then it was her turn. She had known this moment was coming, had prepared for it, but her heart still raced as she was guided forward. Her own coronation would be simpler, less elaborate, but no less significant. She would be crowned Queen Consort, a title that came with its own expectations and duties. As she knelt, her dress pooling around her in waves of silk, Catherine closed her eyes briefly. She thought about all the women who had held this title before her. Some had been beloved, others controversial. Some had wielded significant influence, while others had been relegated to ceremonial roles. What kind of queen would she be? What legacy would she leave? The crown prepared for her was lighter than William's, but no less beautiful. Diamonds caught the light as it was lifted, creating small rainbows that danced across the stone walls. This crown had been modified slightly for her, adjusted to fit her head, to suit her style. It was a blend of tradition and modernity, much like she hoped her reign would be. When the crown touched her head, Catherine felt its physical weight settle onto her skull. But more than that, she felt the metaphorical weight of duty, service, and expectation. Every action she took from this moment forward would be scrutinized, analyzed, criticized, or praised. Privacy had always been limited in her role, but now it would become almost non-existent. The Archbishop spoke words over her, blessings and prayers that had been adapted slightly for modern sensibilities, but still carried echoes of centuries past. She heard phrases about duty, grace, wisdom, and strength. Each one felt like a promise she was being asked to keep, a standard she would be measured against. When she rose and turned to face the congregation, she saw the crowd differently. These weren't just observers anymore. They were her people now in a way they hadn't been before. She had a responsibility to them, to represent their interests, to be a symbol they could be proud of or at least respect. Her eyes found her children again. George looked solemn, perhaps sensing the gravity of what was happening. Charlotte seemed to be fidgeting slightly, her young energy difficult to contain even in such formal circumstances. Louis was being entertained by someone sitting nearby, kept distracted so he wouldn't disturb the ceremony. They looked so small, so vulnerable, and Catherine felt a surge of protective love. How would this day affect them? How would growing up with parents who were now king and queen shape their personalities, their opportunities, their challenges? She wanted desperately to shield them from the harsher aspects of royal life, but she knew that was impossible. The best she could do was prepare them, support them, and love them unconditionally. The ceremony continued with various nobles and officials offering their pledges of allegiance. Catherine watched as one by one they approached and swore their loyalty. Some she knew personally, others were merely faces in a long line of tradition. Each one represented a segment of society, a connection point between the monarchy and the people. Prince Harry was among those who pledged, and Catherine's heart ached at the complicated emotions on his face. The rift between him and William had been painful for everyone involved. She had tried to mediate, to build bridges, but some wounds ran too deep for easy healing. Seeing him here today, fulfilling his duty despite personal conflicts, reminded her of the cost that came with this institution. The music swelled again, a triumphant piece that signaled the ceremony was nearing its end. Catherine felt exhausted despite having done nothing but stand, kneel, and walk. The emotional toll was far greater than any physical exertion. She had been holding herself together so carefully, maintaining perfect composure that her entire body felt tense. Finally, the moment came for them to process back down the aisle as king and queen. William offered her his arm and she took it gratefully, needing the physical connection. Together, they began the long walk toward the Abbey doors, toward the crowds waiting outside, toward their new lives. The faces they passed showed such varied emotions. Joy, curiosity, respect, skepticism, hope, concern. Catherine tried to acknowledge as many as possible with her eyes, offering small nods of recognition. These people had traveled from around the world to be here. The least she could do was see them, truly see them. Her parents looked emotional as she passed, her mother dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Her father stood with military straightness, pride evident in every line of his body. They had given their daughter to this institution, trusting that she would be cared for, that the sacrifice would be worth it. Catherine hoped desperately that trust would prove justified. As they neared the doors, Catherine could hear the roar of the crowd outside growing louder. Thousands of people waited to catch a glimpse of them, to be part of this historic moment. The weight of their expectations felt almost physical, pressing against her from all sides. William squeezed her hand gently, a private gesture of support hidden beneath the formal exterior. They were in this together, partners in the truest sense. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything else in their marriage. With mutual support and understanding, the doors opened and sunlight flooded in, momentarily blinding after the relative dimness of the Abbey. The sound of the crowd became deafening. Catherine raised her hand in a wave, her smile genuine despite her exhaustion. This was her moment, their moment, and she would embrace it fully, even knowing all the complications that would follow. The state coach rocked gently as it moved through London's streets. Catherine sat beside William, both wearing their crowns, both exhausted but unable to show it. The crowds pressed against barriers, waving flags and holding up phones to capture the moment. Every angle of the coach was surrounded by cameras, documenting their journey back to Buckingham Palace. Inside the coach, there was a strange intimacy despite the glass walls that made them visible to everyone. William's hand found hers between them, hidden in the folds of her dress. His fingers were cold, and she realized he must be as overwhelmed as she felt. They exchanged a glance, a moment of understanding that needed no words. The route had been planned to maximize public viewing, which meant the journey took far longer than necessary. Catherine's neck was beginning to ache from the weight of the crown, and she could only imagine how William felt with his heavier piece. But they both maintained their waves, their smiles, their gracious acknowledgement of the people who had come out to celebrate. She noticed an elderly woman in the crowd, tears streaming down her face, holding up a photograph of a young woman in military uniform. The woman's lips were moving, perhaps saying something about the person in the photo, perhaps simply overcome with emotion. Catherine felt her own throat tighten. These moments reminded her that the monarchy meant different things to different people. For this woman, it might represent a connection to someone lost, a touchstone of memory and national identity. Further along the route, a group of young protesters held signs questioning the relevance of the monarchy in modern Britain. Their presence was a reminder that not everyone shared the enthusiasm of the majority. Catherine didn't look away from them. She believed in their right to express dissent, even as she hoped to prove through her actions that the institution could evolve and remain meaningful. The diversity of London was on full display. People of every ethnicity, every background, every belief system had come out. Some wore traditional dress from their cultures of origin. Others wore Union Jack suits. Street vendors sold coronation memorabilia while nearby. Charity workers collected donations for causes they hoped the new reign would support. As the coach passed a children's hospital, staff had brought young patients to the windows to watch. Children in hospital gowns waved enthusiastically, some holding handmade signs. Catherine made sure to wave directly to them, holding their gaze as long as the moving coach allowed. These were the people her early years' work aimed to help, children facing challenges that no child should have to face. William pointed out something in the crowd, and Catherine turned to see a marriage proposal happening on the fringes, one person kneeling with a ring while their partner looked shocked and delighted. Even in the middle of a coronation, life continued in all its messy, beautiful complexity. The couple would forever remember that they got engaged on the day of the coronation, their personal milestone forever linked to this national moment. The coach turned a corner, and Buckingham Palace came into view. The building looked magnificent, flags flying from every pole, bunting decorating the facade. Thousands of people were already gathered in front of the gates, waiting for the balcony appearance that tradition demanded. Catherine felt her stomach flutter with nerves. The ceremony had been formal and scripted. The balcony appearance would feel more exposed, more personal. As they entered the palace grounds, the noise of the crowd became slightly muffled. Palace staff lined the route, offering curtsies and bows as the coach passed. These were people Catherine had worked with for years, familiar faces who had helped her navigate royal life. Their presence was comforting, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this. The coach came to a stop, and immediately handlers were at the doors. William stepped out first, then turned to help Catherine down. Her legs felt slightly unsteady after sitting for so long in such a rigid position, but she managed the descent gracefully. Together, they entered the palace through doors that had welcomed monarchs for generations. The sudden quiet was almost jarring after hours of constant noise. Palace corridors muffled sound, creating pockets of stillness that felt surreal after the chaos of the day. Staff members guided them through familiar hallways toward the rooms where they could prepare for the balcony appearance. Catherine was relieved to see her children waiting for them. George ran forward, then seemed to remember protocol and slowed to a walk. Charlotte had no such restraints, launching herself at her mother with a squeal of excitement. Louis was being held by his nanny, looking tired and ready for his nap. William knelt down to embrace all three children, his crown tilting slightly before he caught it. The gesture was so human, so normal, that Catherine felt tears threaten again. No matter what titles they held, they were still a family. These children needed parents, not just king and queen. George looked up at his father with wide eyes. "Does it hurt? The crown?" he asked with the directness of childhood. William smiled, a real smile that hadn't appeared much during the ceremony. "A bit," he admitted. "But you get used to it." Catherine wondered if that was true, or if it was something parents told children to make difficult things seem manageable. Charlotte wanted to try on Catherine's crown, but her mother gently explained it wasn't possible right now. The disappointment on her daughter's face was painful to see. How did you explain to a 6-year-old that some things, no matter how pretty, came with responsibilities too heavy for children to bear? A coordinator appeared, reminding them of the timing for the balcony appearance. They had 20 minutes to freshen up, to gather themselves to prepare for the final major public moment of the day. After that, there would be the state banquet, but that would at least be indoors, away from the massive crowds. Catherine entered a preparation room where her stylists waited. Makeup was retouched, hairpins were adjusted, the crown was repositioned to sit perfectly. She caught her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman looking back seemed to belong to a different world, one of paintings and history books, not real life. Amanda, her stylist, met her eyes in the mirror. "You're doing beautifully," she said softly. "Everyone says so?" Catherine nodded, grateful for the kindness, but not entirely sure she believed it. She felt like she was performing a role, reading lines someone else had written. When would it start to feel real? William appeared at the door, his uniform adjusted, his crown straight. "Ready?" he asked, and Catherine heard the question beneath the question. Was she ready for what came next? For a lifetime of balcony appearances and state functions and constant scrutiny, she wasn't sure anyone could ever be truly ready for that, but she nodded anyway. Together with their children, they moved toward the famous balcony. Catherine could hear the roar of the crowd even through the thick palace walls. It sounded like the ocean, a constant rush of noise that never quite resolved into individual voices. Her heart began to race and she took several deep breaths to steady herself. The doors to the balcony stood before them, heavy and ornate. Behind those doors, hundreds of thousands of people waited. Millions more would be watching on television. This was one of the most photographed, most documented moments in recent history. Every expression, every gesture would be analyzed endlessly. The doors opened and the sound hit Catherine like a physical force. The roar of the crowd was deafening, overwhelming, a wall of noise that made thinking difficult. She stepped forward onto the balcony, William beside her, their children between them. The crowd somehow grew even louder at the sight of them. The view from the balcony was breathtaking. The mall stretched before them, a river of people flowing from the palace gates all the way to the horizon. Union Jacks waved in waves, creating patterns of red, white, and blue that rippled through the crowd. The sun had broken through the morning clouds, bathing everything in golden light. Catherine lifted her hand to wave, and the crowd responded with renewed enthusiasm. She could see phones and cameras pointing at them from every direction, capturing this moment from countless angles. Tomorrow these images would be on front pages around the world. In years to come, they would appear in history books. Frozen evidence of this day. George stood with remarkable composure for a 10-year-old, waving with a seriousness that reminded Catherine painfully of William at the same age. Charlotte, less restrained, waved enthusiastically with both hands, clearly delighted by the spectacle. Louis looked uncertain, pressing closer to William's leg, not quite sure what to make of all the noise. The family stood together as RAF planes flew overhead, trailing colored smoke that matched the Union Jack. The precision of the formation was remarkable, and the crowd gasped with pleasure at the display. Catherine tilted her head back to watch, momentarily forgetting the cameras, simply experiencing the wonder of the moment. When she looked back at the crowd, she noticed individuals more clearly. A young couple holding a baby up so the child could someday say they had been there. A group of teenagers taking selfies with the palace in the background. An elderly man in military uniform standing at rigid attention, tears visible on his weathered face. Each person had their own story, their own reason for being there. Some had camped out for days to secure good viewing positions. Others had traveled from across the country or around the world. They had invested time, money, and energy into being part of this moment. Catherine felt the weight of that investment, the responsibility to be worthy of their interest. William leaned slightly toward her, his voice barely audible over the crowd. "Are you all right?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. Her emotions were too close to the surface and she couldn't risk breaking down here, in front of everyone. He seemed to understand, his hand briefly touching the small of her back in a gesture of support. The balcony appearance was scheduled to last exactly 8 minutes, a carefully timed performance designed to satisfy public interest without overexposing the family. Catherine had thought 8 minutes would feel like nothing, but standing there under such intense scrutiny it felt eternal. Every second stretched, filled with awareness of being watched, being judged, being documented. Charlotte tugged at her dress, pointing at something in the crowd. Catherine followed her daughter's gaze to see a woman holding up a large portrait of Charlotte herself. The painting was remarkably well done, capturing her daughter's smile perfectly. Catherine made sure to wave directly at the woman, acknowledging the effort and artistry. Behind them, other members of the royal family had joined on the balcony. Catherine could sense their presence, a united front presenting itself to the nation and the world. These relationships were complicated, full of history and tension that the public only glimpsed. But today they stood together, putting aside personal conflicts for the sake of the institution. The crowd began to chant, a rhythmic call for the traditional kiss. Catherine felt her cheeks flush. This was the moment she had most dreaded, a private gesture made utterly public. But it was expected, part of the performance that royal weddings and coronations demanded. She turned to William, who looked equally uncomfortable but resigned. Their kiss was brief, appropriate, more symbolic than romantic. The crowd erupted with approval, and Catherine stepped back quickly, uncomfortable with such intimacy being on display. George looked away, embarrassed as only a preteen watching their parents could be. Charlotte giggled, delighted by the crowd's reaction. As the 8 minutes drew to a close, Catherine took one last long look at the assembled crowd. She tried to commit the moment to memory, knowing she would need to recall it in difficult times ahead. This was what they were working for, what all the sacrifice and scrutiny was meant to serve. These people, their hopes, their need for symbols and continuity in a changing world. The family turned to go back inside, and the crowd's noise followed them until the heavy doors closed. The sudden quiet was almost disorienting. Catherine's ears rang in the silence, her body still processing the sensory overload of the past few minutes. Louis immediately started to cry, overwhelmed and exhausted. William picked him up, murmuring comfort while the boy buried his face in his father's shoulder. The crown William wore prevented him from properly holding his son close, a small but telling reminder of how their roles interfered with normal family life. Staff members appeared with refreshments and guidance for what came next. There would be a brief rest period, then costume changes for the state banquet. The day was far from over, though the most public portions had concluded. Catherine's feet ached in her ceremonial shoes, and she could feel the beginning of a headache forming at the base of her skull where the crown sat. She excused herself to a private room, needing just a few minutes alone before the next phase began. Once inside, she carefully removed the crown, setting it on a cushioned surface. The relief was immediate, like removing a heavy backpack after a long hike. She massaged her scalp gently, trying to ease the tension. Sitting down for the first time in hours, Catherine allowed herself to simply breathe. The emotions she had been containing all day threatened to overwhelm her. Pride, exhaustion, anxiety, hope, fear, and a strange sense of unreality all competed for dominance. She closed her eyes, trying to center herself. A knock at the door interrupted her moment of peace. Pippa entered, having attended the ceremony as family. She rushed to Catherine's side, and the sisters embraced tightly. No words were necessary. Pippa knew her better than almost anyone, understood what this day meant and what it would cost. When they pulled apart, Pippa studied Catherine's face with concern. "Tell me honestly, how are you holding up?" Catherine tried to answer but found her throat too tight. Tears finally came, the release she had needed all day. Pippa held her while she cried, offering tissues and comfort. After a few minutes, Catherine regained her composure. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not with hours of obligations still ahead. She dried her tears, careful not to smudge her makeup too badly. Pippa helped her repair the damage, working with the efficiency born of decades of sisterhood. They talked quietly about the ceremony, about funny moments Pippa had noticed that Catherine had missed while focused on her own part. George apparently had yawned hugely during one particularly long prayer, earning amused glances from nearby dignitaries. Charlotte had dropped her program and then spent several minutes trying to retrieve it from under her seat. These small human moments helped ground Catherine. Yes, this was a coronation with all its weight and history, but it was also a family event, full of the same small mishaps and moments that marked any family gathering. That perspective was something she would need to maintain going forward. Staff knocked again, signaling the end of her brief respite. Catherine stood, straightened her dress, and prepared to face the rest of the day. The crown went back on, its weight familiar now, if not comfortable. She checked her reflection one final time, making sure the woman in the mirror looked like a queen, even if the woman inside still felt like Kate from Berkshire. The state banquet hall glittered with hundreds of candles and crystal chandeliers. Tables stretched the length of the room, set with gold plates and silverware that had served monarchs for centuries. Fresh flowers arranged in towering centerpieces filled the air with delicate fragrance. Catherine entered the room and felt transported to another era, one of formal dinners and diplomatic conversations that shaped nations. She had changed into her evening gown, a stunning creation in deep blue that complemented the sapphires she now wore. The jewels had belonged to Princess Diana, and wearing them always made Catherine feel a connection to the woman she had never met, but whose shadow still touched her life. William had given her these pieces years ago, a gesture of trust and inclusion into the family legacy. The guest list for the banquet read like a who's who of global power. Heads of state from dozens of countries, royalty from remaining monarchies, religious leaders, and select members of British society, all mingled in the reception area before dinner. The conversations happening in this room would influence policy, forge alliances, and set tones for international relations in the months ahead. Catherine moved through the crowd with practiced grace, stopping to greet various dignitaries. Each conversation followed similar patterns, expressions of congratulations, remarks about the ceremony's beauty, inquiries about the children. She smiled, thanked, and responded appropriately, all while her mind tracked who she had spoken to and who still needed attention. The Queen of Spain embraced her warmly, offering advice that came from years of experience. "The first year is the hardest," she said quietly. "You'll feel like you're constantly performing. But eventually you find your rhythm, your authentic voice within the role." Catherine nodded gratefully, storing the wisdom for later reflection. A Commonwealth Prime Minister approached with concerns about recent policy directions. Catherine listened carefully, knowing her role wasn't to make policy but to understand perspectives that could be shared privately with William later. The monarchy's power was subtle now, exercised through influence and conversation rather than decree. Her job was to build relationships that could be leveraged for good. Across the room, she spotted William engaged in animated discussion with several European leaders. He looked tired but energized by the conversation, clearly in his element when talking about issues he cared deeply about. She felt a surge of pride watching him, seeing how naturally he had stepped into this role despite his earlier reluctance. A young server passed with a tray of champagne, and Catherine accepted a glass, though she had no intention of drinking much. Alcohol and exhaustion were a dangerous combination, and she needed to remain sharp for hours yet. She held the glass more for something to do with her hands than for refreshment. The American president made his way over, offering congratulations in his distinctive style. The conversation was friendly, but layered with unspoken political considerations. The relationship between Britain and America remained crucial, and every interaction at this level carried weight beyond mere pleasantry. Catherine navigated the conversation carefully, warm but not presumptuous, interested but not intrusive. Dinner was announced, and the crowd began moving toward their assigned seats. Catherine found her place at the head table, positioned between a visiting prince and a distinguished scientist who had been honored for his contributions to climate research. The seating arrangement was deliberate, designed to facilitate meaningful conversations while honoring protocol. The meal began with a first course that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Chefs had worked for weeks planning this menu, balancing tradition with modern tastes, accommodating dietary restrictions while maintaining elegance. Catherine took small bites, knowing she needed to pace herself through multiple courses while maintaining conversation. The prince beside her proved to be charming and funny, sharing stories about his own country's traditions and the challenges of maintaining relevance in the modern world. They discussed their children, their hopes for the next generation, and the peculiar isolation that came with their positions. It was refreshing to talk with someone who truly understood her unique circumstances. Between courses, William caught her eye from across the table and smiled. Despite everything happening around them, despite the formality and performance, that smile reminded her why they had taken this journey together. They were partners, friends, lovers who had built something real beneath all the pageantry. The scientist on her other side was passionate about his work, explaining complex climate models in ways that made them accessible. Catherine asked questions, genuinely interested and aware that understanding these issues was crucial for her role. The monarchy needed to be informed, to support science and progress, to use its platform for causes that mattered. Speeches began between courses, as various dignitaries offered toasts and remarks. Some were eloquent, others merely dutiful. Catherine listened to them all, applauding at appropriate moments, noting phrases that resonated or ideas that might be worth exploring further. This was how she gathered information, building a mental library of perspectives and concerns. When it came time for William to speak, the room fell into attentive silence. He stood looking every inch the king despite his youth, and spoke about unity, service, and hope for the future. His words were carefully crafted but delivered with genuine emotion. Catherine felt her throat tighten with pride as she listened. This was the man she had chosen, and watching him embrace this role despite his doubts filled her with admiration. The meal continued through multiple courses, each more elaborate than the last. Catherine ate sparingly, aware that her dress was unforgiving and that she would be photographed extensively throughout the evening. The conversation flowed around her, a river of languages and accents that reflected Britain's place in a global community. As dessert was served, a spectacular creation of spun sugar and delicate pastries, Catherine allowed herself to relax slightly. The worst was behind them. The ceremony had gone smoothly. The balcony appearance had been well received, and this dinner was proceeding without incident. Perhaps they would survive this day after all, but beneath her relief lurked a deeper anxiety about what came next. Tomorrow the real work would begin. No more ceremonies to hide behind, no more scripted moments. They would need to define what their reign would look like, what causes they would champion, what kind of monarchs they would be. The expectations were enormous and often contradictory. Coffee was served, along with petit fours and after-dinner drinks. The formal portion of the evening was ending, and guests began to mingle again. Catherine stood, her feet screaming in protest after hours in heels, and rejoined the circulation through the crowd. More conversations, more diplomatic exchanges, more careful navigation of complex relationships. She found herself speaking with a group of charity leaders who worked on causes close to her heart. Early childhood development, mental health support, family welfare. These were the issues she had championed for years, and she was determined to use her elevated platform to make even greater impact. The leaders had ideas and requests, opportunities for royal patronage that could bring attention and resources to vital work. As the evening wore on, guests began to depart. Farewells were exchanged, promises to stay in touch were made, final photographs were taken. Catherine smiled through it all, gracious to the end even as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Her face ached from maintaining pleasant expressions for so many hours. Finally, blessedly, the last guest departed. Palace staff began the enormous task of clearing and cleaning. Catherine slipped off her shoes right there in the hallway, too tired to care about protocol. William appeared beside her, looking equally drained. They walked together through quiet corridors toward their private apartments, crowns finally removed, formal wear loosened. The children were already asleep, watched over by their nanny. Catherine peeked into each room, gazing at their peaceful faces, grateful they could simply be children even as the world around them had shifted so dramatically. Tomorrow would bring new questions and adjustments, but tonight they could rest. Catherine sat at her dressing table, slowly removing the jewelry that had adorned her throughout the day. Each piece was carefully placed in its designated box, returned to the vaults where they would wait for the next state occasion. The sapphires gleamed in the low light, beautiful but cold. She was relieved to set them aside, to shed the weight of history they represented. William entered their bedroom, having already changed into comfortable clothes. He looked younger without all the formal regalia, more like the man she had fallen in love with at university. He sank onto the edge of the bed with a groan, running his hands through his hair now that it was free from the constraints of the crown. They sat in silence for a moment, both processing the enormity of what had happened. The day that had consumed their thoughts for months was now behind them. They were king and queen, titles that would follow them for the rest of their lives. There was no going back, no possibility of choosing a different path. Catherine finally spoke, her voice quiet in the stillness. "Did we do all right?" William looked at her with surprise, then with understanding. Despite the public acclaim, despite the successful ceremony, she needed reassurance that they had measured up to the moment. He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "You were magnificent," he said firmly. "Everyone said so. You carried yourself with such grace and dignity. I was proud to have you beside me." His words brought tears to her eyes, the emotion she had contained all day finally finding release. They held each other for a long moment. Two people who had been through something extraordinary together. The rest of the world saw the pageantry and tradition, but they knew the private cost, the sacrifice of normalcy, the constant pressure of being symbols rather than simply people. Catherine pulled back and wiped her eyes, laughing slightly at her own emotion. "I cried in front of Pippa earlier too," she admitted. "I thought I was holding it together better than this." William smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You don't always have to hold it together. Not with me. This is the one place you can just be yourself." The promise in those words was precious. Catherine knew she would need this sanctuary, this private space where expectations could be set aside. The world would demand so much from her, would critique and analyze every choice. But here, in their bedroom, she could simply be Kate, wife and mother, imperfect and human. They talked late into the night, processing the day's events. William shared conversations he had had with various world leaders, concerns that had been raised, opportunities that had been presented. Catherine told him about the charity leaders she had spoken with, the projects she wanted to champion, the ways she hoped to use her platform meaningfully. Planning together, they began to sketch out what they wanted their reign to represent. Not just maintaining tradition for its own sake, but finding ways to make the monarchy relevant and beneficial to modern Britain. They discussed being more open, more accessible, while still maintaining the dignity the role required. It was a delicate balance, one they would spend years learning to navigate. Catherine mentioned the protesters she had seen during the procession, the signs questioning the monarchy's place in contemporary society. William nodded, his expression serious. He had seen them too, had been thinking about how to address those concerns. They agreed they couldn't ignore the critics, had to find ways to demonstrate value and earn continued public support. The conversation eventually wound down as exhaustion caught up with them. Catherine finished her bedtime routine, washing away the layers of makeup that had been applied and reapplied throughout the day. Her face in the mirror looked bare and vulnerable without all the enhancement. This was who she really was underneath the polish and performance. Climbing into bed beside William, she felt the tension finally leaving her body. The sheets were soft and familiar, a comfort after the day's formality. William wrapped an arm around her and she settled against him, feeling safe in a way she hadn't all day. As she drifted toward sleep, Catherine's mind wandered through the day's moments. The weight of the crown, the roar of the crowds, the pride in her children's faces, the warmth of her sister's embrace, the promise in William's eyes, all of it had combined to create something that felt both surreal and incredibly real. She thought about the woman who had stood before the mirror that morning, nervous and uncertain. That woman felt like a different person now, changed by the day's events in ways she was still understanding. She had walked into Westminster Abbey as a princess and emerged as a queen. The transformation wasn't just about titles, but about accepting a mantle of responsibility that would shape everything that followed. The future stretched before her, full of challenges and opportunities she couldn't yet fully imagine. There would be difficult days ahead, moments when the pressure felt unbearable, times when she would question whether she was equal to the task. But there would also be moments of profound meaning, chances to make real differences in people's lives, opportunities to be part of something larger than herself. Catherine's last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was about legacy. What would history say about her reign? Would she be remembered as someone who brought the monarchy into the modern era, who used her position to effect meaningful change? Or would she be a footnote, another face in the long line of queens who had worn the crown? Only time would tell. But lying there in the darkness with her husband beside her and her children sleeping down the hall, Catherine made a silent promise to herself. She would give everything she had to this role. She would serve with integrity and compassion. She would be worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. The coronation was over, but the real work was just beginning. Tomorrow, she would wake up as Queen Catherine, and every day after that would be an opportunity to define what that title meant. The thought was both terrifying and thrilling. Outside their window, London settled into quiet. The crowds had dispersed, the barriers were being removed, and the city was returning to its normal rhythm. But something had shifted, some invisible line had been crossed. Britain had a new king and queen, and whatever came next would be written by their choices, their actions, their commitment to service. Catherine finally surrendered to sleep, her breathing evening out as dreams began to form. In her dreams, she walked through the Abbey again, but this time without fear or uncertainty. This time she moved with confidence, knowing exactly who she was and what she was meant to do. The crown on her head felt light as air, no burden at all, just a symbol of the purpose she had chosen to embrace. When morning came, she would rise and face whatever challenges awaited, but for now she rested, gathering strength for the long journey ahead. The coronation was complete. The reign had begun, and Catherine, once just Kate from Berkshire, was ready to become the queen she was meant to be.